She helped start the war with a single sunrise. Her planes lifted into the Hawaiian morning and turned Battleship Row into a wall of smoke. She outran the searchlights of the Indian Ocean, took hard punches in the Coral Sea, limped away from Santa Cruz, and kept coming back. By the summer of 1944, the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku, the Soaring Crane, was a veteran of every major carrier fight in the Pacific. Here is the question that drives this story. How did a brand-new American submarine on its first combat patrol find this battle-tested giant in the open Pacific and set in motion the end of her war? If a single underwater hunter could slip past destroyers, past aircraft, past the noise and the chaos of the biggest carrier battle of World War II, what does that say about the future of sea power? Tonight we begin that hunt. Shokaku was built for speed and endurance. She could launch and recover the kind of air groups that decided oceans. When she left home waters in late 1941 with her sister Zuikaku, she carried not only airplanes but a new idea of war, the carrier as the point of the spear. At Pearl Harbor, her pilots formed part of the first wave that cracked the calm of a Sunday morning. It is important to remember that moment because it shaped everything that followed. For the United States, the war at sea became personal. For Shokaku, victory meant staying at the center of the storm. After Hawaii came the Indian Ocean in 1942, where Japanese carriers raided British bases and showed how fast the center of gravity could shift. Then came the Coral Sea in May. Shokaku was hit and badly damaged by American dive bombers. She survived, but survival costs you time. Time in dry dock, time away from the front, time for your enemy to learn lessons you wish they wouldn't. Back at sea that October, she fought in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Again she took a beating. Again she lived. If you look at photographs from those months, you see a ship that has been repaired with care, a ship that somehow keeps returning to the line. By 1943, the Pacific had changed. The U.S. Navy was larger, better trained, and armed with new radar, better fighter tactics, and a conveyor belt of carriers. Shokaku and Zuikaku were still elite, but the margin of superiority was gone. The Japanese crews remained brave and skilled, yet the mathematics of industry were pushing against them like a rising tide. Every month the Americans fielded more planes and more pilots. Every month the Japanese lost men they could not easily replace. When 1944 began, the carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were still dangerous, but they were also thinning out, like a sword that has been sharpened one time too many. June 1944 brought the breaking point. American Marines and soldiers went ashore in the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, to carve airfields that would bring Japan's home islands within range of heavy bombers. Tokyo answered with Operation Eigo. The first mobile fleet, the core of Japanese carrier power, would sail west of the Marianas and strike a decisive blow. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and the hope that land-based aircraft from the nearby islands would help even the odds. Shokaku and Zuikaku sailed with Taiho, a newer armored carrier, and a guard of cruisers and destroyers that could throw up walls of steel and water. On paper, it was still a formidable fleet. Across that same ocean, the United States had something new in play. Dozens of submarines spread like pickets. They were not glamorous, they didn't launch the big headline-grabbing airstrikes. But they listened, watched, reported, and waited. A carrier battle is chaos. Submarines turn chaos into opportunity. One of those boats was USS Kavala, SS-244, a Gato-class submarine fresh from training. She carried 21-inch torpedoes and a crew that had drilled until the steps of an approach were muscle memory. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Kostler, had a simple mission for his first patrol: get into the right water at the right time and find the enemy. That sounds small. It is not. The Pacific is too large to search by luck. You live or die by your ability to predict, to read the ocean, to think like your opponent. Kavala's world was measured in feet and minutes. Feet, because depth decides whether you can see or be seen. Minutes, because the geometry of an attack window is always closing. On the surface at night, she could run fast on diesel engines, charge her batteries, and sniff for targets with radar. By day, she went deep, listening through hydrophones, screw beats, turning circles, the low thunder of big ships. The crew learned each other's voices, each other's habits. In a submarine, trust is not a luxury, it is air. The boat herself was a compromise of steel and space. 6 torpedo tubes forward, 4 aft. A cramped control room with a plotting table where men translated bearings and estimates into firing solutions. A periscope that showed the world like a coin held at arm's length. Machinery that could be temperamental, especially under depth charge. The men slept between torpedoes. They ate well when supplies were fresh and less well when the fresh ran out. They joked because humor helps you breathe. They wrote home when the mailboat found them and saved their letters for months when it didn't. Around mid-June, Kavala reached the waters west of the Marianas, the crossroads where Operation Ego would either make history or end careers. In those 3 days, the ocean was crowded with messages, sighting reports, changes in course, hints of what was rushing toward what. On June 17th, Kavala made contact with a Japanese formation. She sent out reports with course and speed. Those messages were the quiet thread that tied submarines to admirals. On the American side, carriers prepared to take on carriers. On the Japanese side, air groups were being readied for the strike that planners hoped would knock the invasion back into the sea. If you imagine the battlefield only from above, you miss half the story. While pilots were checking maps and gunners were loading belts of ammunition, submariners were trimming ballast tanks and calculating bearings. The air war that would be nicknamed the Marianas Turkey Shoot was only part of the day. Below the surface, boats like Kavala were trying to get ahead of the Japanese fleet and sit squarely in its path, silent and patient. That kind of patience is not passive. It is a choice to do nothing until the one moment when everything matters. Kostler knew that closing on a carrier group meant running a gauntlet. Destroyers were the most dangerous ships in the world to a submarine, fast, maneuverable, full of sonar operators listening for the quietest hum of machinery. A careless approach would be a death sentence. Kavala needed to get near enough to take a periscope look, but not so near that a destroyer's listening gear could pin her down. The ocean adds its own tricks, thermoclines that bend sound, layers of warm and cold water that can hide or reveal you. It is a chessboard of physics. The morning of June 19th arrived heavy with heat and the pressure that comes before a fight. Far above, fighters from both sides were already tangling. American pilots, better trained and better coordinated, were handing Japan the worst air defeats it had seen in the war. But those fighters did not decide everything. While the sky was burning, Kavala was still stalking. She moved slowly, measuring, closing, sliding from one patch of water to the next. Through the periscope, the ocean looked deceptively empty. You rarely see the big ship you want first. You see the hint, the cap of a wave that behaves differently, the silhouette of an escort, a wake where there should be none. Bit by bit, the formation revealed itself. Escorts first, a destroyer's bow wave like a knife. Then, farther off, a larger shape with a flat back, the kind of profile you do not mistake once you've trained for it. A carrier. Kavala eased toward the angle that would give her a shot. Range mattered. Angle on the bow mattered. Speed mattered. All of it had to be right enough that her torpedoes would arrive where the ship would be, not where it was. A submarine attack is not a duel. It is geometry under stress. The crew dropped into the rhythm they had practiced. Bearing, range, plot, update. The torpedo data computer translated numbers into a firing solution. Men whispered, partly out of habit and partly because quiet feels like control. Kostler called for one more look. The periscope rose, cut a narrow line through the surface, then slid back down. The target was recovering aircraft, about the worst time for a carrier to be hit, the best time for an attacker to strike. Planes coming in, fueled and armed systems cycling, hangar decks full of vapors, elevator platforms moving. In that state, a carrier is both busy and vulnerable. Kavala's captain weighed two truths. A narrow spread of torpedoes gives you more punch on a precise point. A wider spread buys insurance against an unexpected turn. He had no luxury of perfect knowledge. The destroyers were still out there, still listening, still ready to crash in. He had seconds to choose. Under 30 feet of water, you cannot ask for permission or take a poll. You trust your training and the feel of the moment. The men at the tube stood ready. 5 weapons could go in a heartbeat, each a steel cylinder with its own small world of gyros and compressed air and warhead. The bow was trimmed, the boat was balanced, the ocean outside felt like a weight pressing against the hull. Somewhere up there, a carrier crew was landing aircraft and racing to haul them below. Somewhere up there, deck crews were moving bombs and fuel hoses. Somewhere up there, a veteran of Pearl Harbor was on a straight line through a patch of ocean, not yet aware that someone below had done the math. Kostler looked one last time, because one last time is how you live with your own choices. He lowered the scope. He gave the order. In the control room, the words were simple, the kind that carry more meaning than they sound like they do. Stand by. Open outer doors. Set depth. Set gyro. Firing solution. Calculated. And that is where we will leave them for tonight. A young boat, a seasoned enemy, and a moment balanced on inches and seconds. In Part 2, we will follow the torpedoes to the target and see what happens inside a carrier when steel and fire meet fuel and air. Before we go, I want to hear from you. If you were in Kostler's shoes, would you fire a tight 3-torpedo shot at a vital point, trusting precision, or spread the pattern wider to hedge against a sudden turn? Tell me your choice and why in the comments. Then join us for the next chapter, when the soaring crane meets the hunter in the deep. They say the ocean has 2 voices on days like this. One voice is the roar above, fighters clawing for altitude, engines screaming, tracer lines stitching the sky. The other is the whisper below. Bearings murmured in the dark, a captain counting seconds, a boat sliding through layers of water like a hand through silk. On the morning of June 19, 1944, both voices spoke at once. The air would remember this day as the Marianas turkey shoot. But our question is the one the deep asks. While the sky burned, could one submarine, on its first patrol, change the fate of a veteran fleet carrier? If the answer is yes, then what really decides a carrier battle? The pilots you see, or the hunter you don't? Dawn came hot and hard. To the east, American carriers were launching wave after wave, filling the horizon with the glitter of wings. To the west, the first mobile fleet drove forward, Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, armored decks and practiced crews, still confident enough to believe the day could be theirs. Not long after sunrise, an American submarine named R&BLORE found Taiho and put a torpedo into her. The flagship stayed afloat at first, but the hit opened the kind of wound you cannot see from a distance. Fumes building in the wrong places, a threat that grows with every minute. Above, fighters were dueling. Below, the clock started ticking for a giant. Far from that first blow, another boat listened and moved. Kavala was young and careful and lucky enough to be exactly where the sea lanes narrowed between purpose and chance. The crew felt the day through instruments, a hydrophone's faint thrum becoming a steady beat, a navigator's hand sliding across grease pencil lines. The captain's eye rising to a periscope and falling again. In a submarine, every action has a cost. Raise the scope, and you might gain a sliver of truth. Raise it too long, and the sliver becomes a silver flash a destroyer will notice. The boat worked between risks. The enemy formation revealed itself in pieces. First a destroyer, sharp bow, clean wake, the kind of ship that hunts for a living. Then a second screen farther out, pacing like a shepherd dog. Beyond them, something larger disturbed the water's skin with a wide, even V. The periscope showed only a slice, but it was enough. A flat-topped silhouette, a carrier. The math began in earnest. Speed, course, angle on the bow. These are simple words until you are trying to solve them as the range collapses. The plotting party fed the torpedo data computer. The numbers clicked into a picture even as the picture kept changing. The captain called for small speed changes, gentle turns, little adjustments that felt like breathing with the ocean. Zigzags from the target could ruin the geometry. Escorts could force a dive and a missed chance. Patience is courage in this world. Knowing when to hold your fire is as dangerous as knowing when to take the shot. Kavala edged ahead of the carrier's track, looking for that brief rectangle of water where lines cross and intentions meet. Another periscope glance showed deck crews busy, aircraft returning. It meant fuel lines snaking, bombs and shells moving, elevators working. An organized chaos that makes a carrier deadly and fragile at the same time. If a torpedo struck now, it would not only break steel. It might turn the ship's own breath against her. The last minutes before an attack are quiet by design. Men speak softly. Hands rest near levers they have pulled 1,000 times in drills. The captain watches for one more piece of certainty and accepts that there will never be enough. He chooses anyway. Kostler judged the distance and the angle. A tight pattern would hammer one vital place. A wider pattern would guard against a sudden turn. He must also think about survival, because a successful shot means destroyers will come. He built a spread that could do the job and live with the ocean's surprises. At about 11:22, some say a minute earlier, some a minute later, the order came. Fire. Tubes coughed in sequence, each fish taking its path and its chance. In those seconds after firing, the boat is both hunter and target, suspended between triumph and disaster. Kavala sank deeper, turned to slip away, and listened. What she heard first was the long wait. Torpedoes do not strike instantly. They work through distance, the way an argument works through a pause. Then the ocean spoke again, this time with a short, heavy word no one mistakes. One hit, then a second, nearer and louder, then a third. Some later readings argue for a fourth. What nobody disputes is what those hits did to Shokaku's starboard side and to the air inside her. Fire is not just flame. It is vapor finding a spark. It is heat turning a deck into a kiln. It is men trying to move through smoke that burns the lungs. Shokaku's pumps churned and her crew fought. Power faltered. List increased. Planes and munitions on the hangar deck created a problem with its own gravity. Heavy things rolling where they shouldn't. Fuel spreading into places it was never meant to go. The carrier still lived, and a living ship is stubborn. But the chemistry of disaster had formed. Around 12:10, an internal detonation tore through the hangar levels. You can diagram the physics later. Vapors, ignition sources, pressure fronts, but on board it felt like the ship inhaled and coughed fire. Bulkheads meant to protect became traps when doors jammed. Ventilation that helped crews breathe also moved the wrong gases into the wrong spaces. Damage control teams did what trained sailors always do. They went toward the heat. Some made a difference for a while, some did not come back. Time on a sinking ship is not uniform. Minutes stretch when you are fighting a valve. They vanish when a corridor fills with smoke. Reports reached the bridge in fragments. The list grew. The bow settled. The carrier bled speed and authority. Across the fleet, other ships saw her pain and moved in to help, but help comes with a limit. A carrier that cannot control her own fires becomes a danger to anything that ties up alongside. By early afternoon, the end was no longer a secret. Around 14:01, Shokaku went down bow first, the stern lifted as if in protest, then vanished. Witnesses recorded further underwater explosions as compartments crushed and materials failed under pressure. The sea closed and went flat in the way it always does, hiding the last few seconds of a ship's life under a sheet of ordinary water. The numbers that remain are hard and human. Roughly 1,272 men did not return, crew and air group both. About 570 were pulled from the water, many of them by the light cruiser Yahagi and the destroyers Urakazi and Hatsuzuki. Other accounts add a fourth name, Wakatsuki. The exact list matters because the people matter. Officers who had led since 1941. Deck crews who knew every bolt by touch. Pilots who had trained for years and had nowhere to land. A navy is not just steel. It is memory, skill, and the ability to do a complicated thing together under pressure. Much of that went under with the soaring crane. For Kavala, the attack was only half the story. A submarine that kills a carrier has just announced herself to every destroyer in the area. The crew could already feel the counterblow gathering in the way engines change pitch and sonar men sit straighter. They would soon learn how long an hour can be when depth charges fall in patterns and steel answers with a groan from somewhere deep in its bones. That trial belongs to the next chapter. Before we leave this one, step back and ask what the day revealed. In the air, American pilots were riding a headline victory, shooting down so many attackers that the battle earned a nickname no one forgot. But the deep wrote a quieter line beneath it. 2 American submarines struck 2 of Japan's key carriers on the same day. 1 torpedo started a slow catastrophe for Taiho. 3, perhaps 4, broke Shokaku's back and set her on a path no crew could reverse. The lesson is not that aircraft carriers are weak, it is that when fuel, ordnance, and flight operations stack up at the wrong moment, one well-placed blow can turn a fortress into a furnace. You have just traveled from the click of a firing key to the silence that follows a ship's last bubbles. You felt why timing rules the undersea war, why geometry and nerve matter as much as firepower, and why a few minutes at midday could undo years of experience and pride. The hunter won. Now the sea asks a different question. Can the hunter survive the price of victory? In the next part, we descend with Kavala as 3 destroyers slam the water above her with more than 100 depth charges, trying to crush her like a fist closes around a match flame. How do you hide when the ocean itself becomes a weapon? How do you keep a crew steady when the hull ticks and the lights flicker and the air turns sharp with battery fumes? Join me for part 3. The torpedoes have found their mark. The payback is coming. You can tell when the ocean turns against you. It starts with a faint ticking in the hull, then a shiver runs through the decks, and suddenly the sea is speaking in a new language, hard, fast, unforgiving. That was the sound inside USS Kavala after she struck Shokaku. The crew knew what came next, because every submarine knows the price of a clean kill. The hunter becomes the hunted. Here's the question that drives this final chapter. Can a single submarine survive 3 hours under a rain of explosions? And what does that survival tell us about how the Pacific War truly turned? The first pattern of depth charges fell like a slammed door. Air shook in the lungs. Lights flickered. Dust drifted down in slow motion, even as hearts sped up. The men didn't shout. They tightened their focus. Orders were short. Trim the boat. Check for leaks. Watch the gauges. In a submarine, panic is louder than any weapon, so discipline must be louder still. 3 destroyers were up there, angry and precise. They had heard the torpedo hits and turned that sound into a map. They began to box the water, laying patterns where Kavala might be, then shifting those patterns when the echo men heard steel moving in the dark. The charges were set to different depths, time to push the boat down, pull it up, pin it between shock waves. Over the next hours, more than 100 blasts, about 106 by later counts, walked across the ocean above Kavala, each one a question. Are you still alive? Inside the boat, the answers were practical. A valve stuttered, a gauge fogged, a line trembled, and then steadied. Some sound gear wavered under the shock. The captain said as little as possible and exactly what was needed. He eased the boat deeper, then shallower to slip under a thermal layer where sound bends. He changed course by degrees, never enough to announce a pattern. He trusted his men to run the drill the way they had practiced it when the water was calm and the stakes were theoretical. Now the stakes were simple. Hold the hull together and keep the ocean on the outside. Depth charges are not just noise, they are pressure. The hull answered with groans from places only metal knows, a reminder that steel is strong but not invincible. The crew rode those sounds the way a pilot rides turbulence, eyes on instruments, mind on checklists. They felt the boat's small movements as clearly as a driver feels a skid. They adjusted ballast by instinct and measurement. The word flooding is the one no one wants to hear. When a trickle appeared in a ventilation line, they contained it and moved on. Work is a shield. Time stretched. Minutes felt like chapters. Between barrages, the men listened with the hydrophones and heard propellers searching, screws accelerating, pausing, turning back. Another pattern rumbled down, closer this time, and the hull shook again. In moments like these, you learn how long a breath is. You learn that the difference between fear and focus is a sentence. Do the next necessary thing. Destroyers hunt with patience, too. They know a wounded submarine will try to creep away. They spread their net wider, then narrow it again when a faint contact gives them hope. Kavala answered not with speed, but with silence. She moved at the slowest possible rate that still counted as motion, turning into the blind spots made by temperature layers and the noise of her attackers' own engines. She did not try to outrun anything, she tried to outlast everything. After the second hour, fatigue showed up like an extra man in the compartment, one who offered bad advice. The petty officers kept the crews sharp. Rotate the listening watch, check the same valves again, sip water. An exhausted mistake could be as deadly as any charge. Above them, the destroyers were running their own races, keeping stations, calculating fuel, trading places at the edge of the pattern so no one ship lost the thread. It was a duel of nerves and arithmetic. At some point, the pattern began to drift, not because the destroyers lacked will, but because the ocean is enormous and a submarine that refuses to cooperate with your expectations becomes a problem of probability. Kavala used that drift, a measured turn, a small change in depth. The sonar man called out bearings with carefully neutral words. The captain nodded and gave directions as if he were guiding a car through city streets. The water beat time on the hull. The boat answered with steadiness. When the last heavy pattern fell, it felt different. Farther off, a little less certain, like thunder from a storm that has just slipped past. The crew did not celebrate. They scanned for damage again, checked batteries, felt for heat in electrical runs, and waited for the next set that thankfully did not come. 3 hours after the first charges, the sea had gone back to ordinary. That word, ordinary, never sounded so good. Kavala had lived. She had dents in her day and stories in her metal. Some instruments were shaken, some fittings scuffed, but the boat was whole, the crew unbroken, and the kill already behind them. Survival was not an accident. It was a combination of training, calm leadership, and the kind of luck that follows people who do the basics right under pressure. For that day's work, Kavala would later receive a Presidential Unit Citation. Honors, though, only tell a small part of the truth. The larger truth is that a submarine on her first patrol changed the balance of a carrier battle and then refused to die in the counterattack. While Kavala was fighting to stay alive, the wider war was making decisions of its own. Earlier that same day, Taiho, the pride of the Japanese carrier force, had taken a single torpedo from another American submarine, Albacore. At first, the great ship seemed to shrug it off. She kept station. Planes still launched. On a chart, she looked fine. But inside, gasoline vapors gathered in places where men were working, moving, breathing. Ventilation is a friend until it becomes a pathway for danger. Hours later, a spark met a cloud, and Taiho erupted from within. A flagship died not because an enemy pounded it with shells, but because physics does not forgive. The next day, another carrier, Hio, was struck from the air by American planes and went down after onboard explosions. Taken together with the death of Shokaku, these losses were more than steel and tonnage. Japan's elite deck force, ships, aircraft, and the trained pilots to fly them, was gutted. You can replace a hull. You cannot quickly replace a veteran aviator. The skies over the Marianas had already told one story: hundreds of Japanese planes destroyed in the turkey shoot, many with experienced men in the cockpits. The ships told the second story. Even the survivors would operate with fewer trained hands and fewer decks to bring those hands home. That is why this battle felt different when it was over. It wasn't just a win, It was a turning of the tide that could not be turned back. The United States kept building carriers, training pilots, and learning from mistakes. Japan now faced a cliff: shrinking flight decks, shrinking air groups, shrinking time. The Pacific is a strategist's ocean. When your carriers and pilots are gone, the map grows larger than your options. Kavala's part in that turning is clear. She proved that submarines were not only commerce raiders or scouts, they were carrier killers when position, patience, and decision came together. She proved that a single well-placed salvo could do what 100 bombs sometimes could not if it arrived at an enemy's most vulnerable moment. And she proved that undersea warfare is as much about endurance as it is about attack. To strike and then survive is a complete act. Her story did not end in 1944. Kavala went on to complete more patrols, then survived the war and the scrapping lists that took so many sisters. Today she rests in Galveston, Texas, where visitors can walk her narrow passageways, touch the steel that once trembled under depth charge, and feel how small the control room is for a ship that once changed the course of a day. Museums often tell stories with plaques. Kavala tells hers with space. Stand between the torpedo tubes, and you will understand how close men lived to the weapons they fired. Stand under the periscope well, and you will understand how little the captain saw when he made the biggest decisions of his life. So what do we take with us from the soaring crane's last day and the hunter that sent her down? We see that sea power is a chain, and you can break it at many links. The pilot in the air, the deck crew on the hangar level, the engineer minding the pumps, the sonar man listening for the faintest hum. On June 19th and 20, all those links mattered. The air battle smashed Japan's ability to contest the sky. The submarine strikes knocked away the decks that could have carried any recovery. Together, they didn't just win a fight. They made the rest of the war shorter for the United States and harsher for an enemy that could no longer replace what it lost. There is a quiet kind of courage at the end of this. The Japanese sailors who stayed at their stations on Shokaku and Taiho did what professionals do. The American crews who stalked, fired, and then absorbed the payback did the same. The ocean does not give out easy rolls. It gives you moments, and what you do inside them becomes history. As we close this chapter, I want to ask you what mattered more to the outcome: the massacre in the air that stripped Japan of pilots, or the submarine kills that removed the decks those pilots needed? Which link in the chain do you think was the one that truly broke? Tell me in the comments. Your take helps us test the story against other eyes. If this series lit up a part of the war you haven't seen before, stay with us. Next, we follow the strange, short life of the biggest carrier ever sunk by a submarine, the giant Shinano, and the American boat that found her on a cold November night. The ocean has more voices yet, and we're just learning to hear them. Subscribe to WWII Chronicles so you don't miss the next hunt.